everyone. This is Casey Swegman from the Tahari Justice Center. It is 4 o'clock on the dot, and we've already got quite a few people with us. We had over 100 people registered for this webinar, so I'm sure they will all join us in time. But out of respect for Laura Vidal, who's with us all the way from Australia and got up bright and early to be with us today, we're going to go ahead and get started. So just as an introduction, I am the project manager of the Forced Marriage Initiative at the Tahari Justice Center, and the Tahari Justice Center's FMI is hosting this webinar today. It's part of a series put on by the National Network to Prevent Forced Marriage at the Tahari Justice Center, which is a national nonprofit organization working to protect courageous women and girls fleeing violence through direct services, public policy and advocacy, and training and education. Before we start the webinar and introduce our guest presenter, I just want to go over some basic housekeeping. We will be taking questions and comments from the audience during this presentation, and the way that you contribute questions is by using the question function on your GoToWebinar software. You can also type questions into the chat box. I will be monitoring both, and Laura will be looking at the chat box as well. We will be monitoring it during the presentation and taking moments to pause and share comments or take questions if they're relevant in the moment. Otherwise, if you feel you have a more global question, you can hold it till the end, and Laura will take those at about 15 or 10 till the hour. But we really do encourage you to use that function and to participate and to create a dialogue with Laura, since we don't have her with us all that often, and she is a great resource. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce her and then hand over control of the webinar. So Laura is a social worker with a master's degree in human rights law and policy from Sydney, Australia. She's for more than a decade, or almost a decade, she's worked to provide direct services and support to survivors of human trafficking, slavery, and slavery-like practices, including forced marriage. The Freedom Advocates Project is an opportunity for survivors to be a part of the movement to end slavery in Australia, and it's delivered with a comprehensive framework to ensure that risks of re-exploitation are eliminated and control is maintained with the survivor throughout their engagement. And that whole project is what Laura is here with us today to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over presenter controls to you, Laura, and you can take it away.
Great. How are we? We can see the slides?
Seeing the slides, yep, perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Casey, for inviting me to deliver this webinar. As Casey said, I am from Sydney in Australia, and we have been working on a framework for the last 7 years to engage survivors or people with lived experience of trauma ethically in our work, and particularly in our advocacy. So to give you a little bit of context, forced marriage is part of Australia's human trafficking and slavery offences criminally. And so as a result of that, it significantly influences how responses are delivered and how the issue is defined. So, I mean, that's a whole other webinar discussion, but I think it's important to understand the references, I guess, to human trafficking and slavery that I will make throughout the presentation are simply because forced marriage is considered to be human trafficking or slavery in Australia's context. The purpose of developing the Freedom Advocates program, I guess, was for 3 reasons. The first was around the recognition of the power differential between professionals in the sector who are working to support individuals who've experienced forced marriage or other forms of exploitation, and that it's really important that we recognise that power differential as a way to engage people in an empowered and equal way. The second is, in our experience, it's actually much easier to engage people in advocacy or other types of work. It's easier to do that without this framework. People are really willing to offer their time and their experience, and often feel really, really grateful for the services that we've provided, and will offer themselves quite readily to being part of change. Or sharing their story to benefit your organisation. And it's pretty easy to take that offer up. What's more difficult is to take a step back and actually challenge things like power and question whether or not that person has been empowered to be on a level playing field. And the third thing is really about a genuine recognition that survivors, their voices should be front and centre in the advocacy work that we do, and that they should have an equal seat at the table. So around 7 years ago, we started working on this project called the Freedom Advocates Project. And it's a holistic framework that builds survivors in an equal and empowered way to be part of change. We recognise that our connection to human stories is biological. Stories connect us. When we listen to something, it's always more powerful when there's a story there. We have constant requests from journalists who are saying, you know, they don't have a story without a lived experience. And that's because we have emotional experiences that biologically connect us to our very essence of being a human. The emotional experiences then lead to helping behaviour. So when people can connect with a story, it more often leads to action, and we elicit emotions of empathy and personal distress. So that situation is so distressing, I need to do something about it. So we often see this in a fundraising context, for example, in the not-for-profit sector, where people will often want to showcase their work via a lived experience or by somebody's story, because people connect to that story and then feel feeling more inclined to give. But it is our responsibility that we strike that balance to ensure that they can use their story in a way that both empowers them and also serves a greater purpose. And so it's important on that level then to say, okay, we might be hosting this event and there is a fundraising element, but where's the mutual benefit for the survivor that we may invite to share their story? And as we progress through the webinar, I'll also talk about the framework that we use in terms of, you know, not just asking any survivor to be part. It is about asking people who have expressed their interest, been trained and supported to then be part of an ongoing program where they can be part of that opportunity. Equitable inclusion of survivors, and we use the word equitable quite intentionally. It has a little difference to equal, and it's about recognising that we don't start equal, particularly if the people that we're working with have received a service from us. There is a very, very clear power differential there, and when you're engaging survivors, it's important to remember that to the audience that you're speaking with and to the people that you are engaging with, that might just be a story, and people feel emotionally engaged with that story, they feel connected to it for a very short period of time. But the person telling that story, that's a very significant part of their life. And there's a possibility of risk of harm and physical and psychological damage if that isn't managed correctly. Lived experience is highly valuable for more than promoting an organisation. It can inform legislation, policy and service delivery responses, and it is also an opportunity for survivors to grow. There is a particular theory that has actually been developed in the United States around military and people who have come back from combat with PTSD. And they present this whole idea of bouncing forward. So rather than expecting that people who've experienced trauma will bounce back and expect that they'll become a person that they once were, that's actually unrealistic. And it presents this idea of bouncing forward, acknowledging that somebody having experienced trauma will never be the same person that they were before that trauma occurred. But that doesn't mean that that's a negative thing, and that when empowered and supported, they have the opportunity to bounce forward and grow from that experience. and that people can find that quite a validating experience based on the trauma that they have been through. A particular academic in Australia, Margaret Bennett, talks about survivors of trauma seeing their own personal experiences as understanding the complexities in self-disclosure. So only people who have experienced trauma really understand what it means to then self-disclose and to do that publicly. They can be role models for others in their life after trauma. So this sort of alludes to the theory from the United States, where we need to see people who've experienced trauma as people who can contribute, who are role models for other people. But we can only do that if we provide them the support to be able to engage in a way that is not going to cause further risk of harm, and engage and enter into open and transparent conversations with people about that. For some survivors, significant life events can be catalysts for finding purpose, and they're powerful vehicles to assist us to provide opportunities. So and you probably see it all the time. I'm not sure of the demographic that's attending here in the webinar, but particularly, I'm assuming a lot of you are community service providers, and you will see that many people after an experience of trauma really have almost sort of like an awakening, where they learn things about themselves that they never knew existed before. They learn the limits of their strength and their power, and they also learn about their resiliency. And as a result of that, many, many people find purpose, a new purpose. They, look at defining their life in different terms. And so that often creates a platform for people to feel like they want to contribute to this area of work. And that's a really positive thing. But when it goes too far on the other end, you end up having people who submerge their life into their trauma experience, and it can become quite re-traumatizing. So the framework that we use actually provides an opportunity for people to not assume their identity as a trauma survivor for the rest of their life. Our responsibility as service professionals lies in the equitable empowerment of survivors. They can participate wholly, make autonomous decisions about how and why and where their story will be shared, because that then gives the ability for them to separate out their experience of trauma or their experience of exploitation and their identity. Because what we do know is that when people do not have the opportunity to do that, we are creating significant situations of risk for re-traumatization and compounding the already existing trauma. So 3 key principles that we use in our work with people are ethical, empowered, and equitable. And so ethical really refers to how we engage with people. Have we considered all of the risks, physical, psychological? Will being public with a narrative cause harm? So do the people who harmed that individual, are they still actively looking for them? Are they pursuing them? Are there active legal matters at hand? If there is yes to any of those questions, again, it's really needing to take a step back and saying, is this something that is a really safe option for somebody right now? Are there children involved? I'm just going to take a little sidestep and talk about our policy on the use of children. We do not use children at all as a blanket rule for any sort of public advocacy. That includes photographing, videoing, public speaking, media appearances. We believe that children are unable to give full and informed consent and really understand the long-term implications of becoming public about that. So as a project, we will not engage with children on that level, and we will wait until somebody turns 18 if they are expressing a desire to engage with this sort of thing. It is worked through in a therapeutic setting until they're 18, and then we will look at whether or not that makes sense for them at that period of time. The empowered perspective is really about opportunities having a mutual benefit. Is it in line with the goals set out by the survivor when they say they want to be part of advocacy work? Is what you're asking them to do having mutual benefit? And what is the purpose of engaging with that lived experience? It has to be greater than simply benefiting your organisation, because particularly if that individual has received services from your organisation, the power imbalance is and divide is too wide to be able to reconcile that. However, if it is about talking into a greater conversation, which may lead to policy or legislative change, and they do talk about their experience of receiving services from your organisation as being, a significant part of their journey, that's okay. If it's about sharing a story for the purposes of fundraising, it needs to be really clear. And our approach to that is engaging somebody who's quite experienced. Their first experience should not be a fundraising experience, because it's not equal, and it's not, there is no mutual benefit there. In terms of the equitable piece, it's really about seeing that training, information and resources are available. And is there compensation for the time spent working with the organisation? As a professional, I get asked to speak all the time, and I go and I do that, and I'm paid a salary. Bringing a survivor alongside me and not acknowledging and respecting the fact that it's their time, their expertise, and they're not being paid as an employee of the organisation is a baseline factor in equality and equity. So our framework that I'm about to walk through is a funded framework, and we do that very intentionally, and we wouldn't run the program if we didn't have the funding to do so, because we don't consider it to be empowering for somebody to come alongside myself or another one of my colleagues and engage in a conversation where one member is paid for their time and the other is not. So this particular quote at the bottom of the slides I really like, because it really looks at that balance. So appreciating and merely acknowledging the bravery, courage and commitment of a survivor to share their story is no longer enough. We must nurture and facilitate the equal inclusion of survivor voices in all aspects of policy and service delivery, and in doing so, empower them to be agents of change. This challenges us to move beyond the basic level of professionals and service delivery personnel to be tokenistically acknowledging that bravery and courage, and actually providing a platform to bring survivors alongside us on this journey, and doing it in a way where they are empowered, things are equitable, and we are using a really strong foundation of ethics. The things that we do avoid are objectification and re-traumatization. So we're not creating the poster people of the issue. So it's also about balancing engagement opportunities and re-traumatization, re-exploitation of survivors, and use of images and videos of children for the purpose of self-promotion or profit. So that gets us back to that conversation there around having an equal playing field where there's mutual benefit of the engagement. So how do we do this? What does this look like? The Freedom Advocates Project empowers survivors of modern slavery to do just that, to use their experiences to create positive change. The project seeks to bring the voice of survivors to key policy discussions. That includes public and private consultations, so taking people to Parliament with us, to meet with various ministers or advisors, that happens in tandem with ourselves. Ensure experience of modern slavery are reflected in awareness raising, community education, are accurate and respectful. So when you're leading a campaign, have you consulted survivors to really look at what does these messages tell us or show us about the issues that we're facing? Is it respectful? Does it accurately depict what people would experience? Have we picked a strategy that is even going to reach people? One particular example is Margaret, who's quoted there on the slide, who's been an advocate with us now for 6 years. And we took her along to a meeting with a minister where we were talking about the issue of domestic workers in private households. And the particular person we were meeting with talked about this idea that their department had, that they were working on an awareness raising campaign where they were going to put out a list of printed materials at the airport, and they were going to look into some television ads. And she really said, you know, with all due respect, when I was at the airport with my employer who was chaperoning me through the airport, there is no way I would have had an opportunity to go and pick up any kind of flyer within the airport that may or may not have had the kind of information on it that I needed. Secondary to that, she said, at the airport, I had absolutely no reason to not trust the people that I was with, that the opportunity that had been promised to me wasn't going to eventuate. So even if I did see that flyer, I would not have connected the relevancy to my situation because I was here on a job and I've been told I was going to be paid. So then the person we were meeting with sort of sat back in their chair and was really quite shocked and surprised by that comment. And she said, oh, we're going to totally have to rethink what our departmental plans were around this campaign. And that was a really, really powerful moment for somebody who has been in that situation to be able to give that kind of feedback to a policymaker who had never thought to engage with a survivor before. And this entire campaign that they were about to spend, you know, quite a bit of money rolling out is now something that didn't go ahead, and a more appropriate campaign that was a better spend of resources was able to be directed as a result of that. The third element, which is really where a lot of our forced marriage survivors are quite powerful, is around offering mentorship to others who may be experiencing exploitation or may be in a situation that they're quite ambivalent about what they'd like to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a moment. So survivors of forced marriage generally have quite a number of safety and security issues with being public around their experiences. So we tread very carefully in that space, but being able to offer themselves as mentors to other people at risk or other people ambivalent to make decisions has actually been a catalyst for change for many of those young people who are at risk, because they feel reassured that there will be safety and support if they make a decision such as leaving their family for the purposes of remaining safe. So we engage people in three ways: as public advocates, as consultant advocates, and peer mentors. Every individual has their own motivation for wanting to share their story for good. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to work or that it's going to make sense. And everybody also gets to choose how they wish to engage. So people might say to you, I really want to share my story, but I don't want to be in the media. That's cool. we would then engage them as a consultant advocate, and means that they would do things like consult on policy papers, come to meetings with government, engage in a confidential manner, focus groups, roundtables, that sort of arena, whereas others are quite keen to be able to engage with the media, in which case we would then work with them very, very intensively to prepare them for that opportunity. That includes delivering professional media training, being able to act as their agent between the media and themselves, so they're not getting this ongoing, persistent contact by members of the media. And the other thing that we do as well is have a process in place where individuals will engage with a psychologist external to the project, so that they are able to reconcile their motivations with reality. That one young person, for example, said, yes, I want to share my story to the public because I need my parents to know that everything they ever told me was not true. That I am fine, that I am healthy, that I am well, I am studying, I will succeed, and I will do I have proved them wrong. And through working with the psychologist they were able to really identify that their main motivation for engaging in the project should not be revenge or validation by people who have hurt them, because they may not actually ever achieve that. And to enter into a public narrative type sharing situation for that purpose doesn't mean that it's going to be empowering, because they will not necessarily achieve that. So the process, I guess, of engaging somebody is a 3-step process, which will engage in training and development very first. So we wait until somebody self-identifies that they wish to use their story for change or share their story or help other people. We will never approach somebody unsolicited because we think they'd be good at doing that. We wait until we start to hear things from them about being interested in using their story for good. We will then engage in a fairly intensive training and development program, which includes 9 modules spread across media management, public speaking, stage presence, policy, briefings, question and answer type situations, boundaries, and they will have 3 sessions with a clinical psychologist before any of this begins, so that they're actually really grounded in their own motivations and goals, and that they can actually be reconciled through the process of advocacy, and also be equipped with skills and tools so that if they're not achieving things that they thought would be possible, and as anyone working in advocacy would know, change is slow, and you don't get a lot of instant gratification out of this work. So it also helps to prepare people for that reality that change may not happen, and it may not happen in the way that we want it to, and our resiliency as advocates, being able to continue to push that envelope, is often a little bit more challenging for people who are personally affected by the issue. So the psychologist will do 3 sessions at the beginning, and then usually engage in, as much or as little as needed along the course of their participation. For those that are choosing to engage in peer mentoring type work, that engagement with the psychologist happens ongoing before and after each one of their peer mentoring sessions, to ensure that the impact on the advocate themselves is managed in a way that is safe and healthy. Before somebody is ready to do this publicly, for example, that could take up to a year. So it's not a rushed process. It's not an opportunistic process. It's not, oh, we've got this opportunity, let's find somebody who'll be able to meet that need. It's really about, this person has identified they want to be part of advocacy. We're going to build up their capacity to do that. And then when opportunities arise, they'll be invited to do that. Advocates are supported the entire time by our project. So as I said before, we act as agents in that process. We help them prepare for events, speaking engagements, media opportunities, arrange for financial compensation. We also develop an individual management plan for every advocate every 12 months. So it is clear what their own personal training and development goals are, what their own interests in advocacy are, what their focus areas are. That includes somebody saying to me at the start of the year, look, really not interested in doing any media appearances. I feel uncomfortable and not ready for that. I will then not ever ask them to engage with the media, simply because that it reinforces the power imbalance. So we have a clear arrangement at the start what somebody is agreeing or not agreeing to participate in. If I go ahead and then ask them to do something that, or invite them to do something that they haven't articulated a desire to do, it sends that person into that spin of, oh, it must be really important. Oh, Laura's done so much for me. Maybe I can just do it this one time. And that takes away the ability for that survivor to be in control of their engagement. So unless they come and self-initiate a discussion around having changed their mind, we wouldn't review that until the next 12-month cycle rolls around, where we would evaluate their participation in the previous 12 months, their participation on an ongoing basis, and then look at what, if that has changed, what other training and professional development goals would be needed. The opportunities are then managed again by the project, and you would have a member of the staff who would evaluate that opportunity for somebody on their behalf, and then we would invite people formally to participate, where that invitation includes all of the invitation information about the opportunity, and an opportunity to consent to engage or to not engage. It includes things like how much their honoraria payments will be, what the preparation is, how much time is required, what the reach of the opportunity is, what the expected or intended impact is, so somebody can make fully informed consent about that participation. So the key principles in action, to summarize, include developing a framework. That's the beginning step. Developing a framework for empowering people with lived experience to be advocates and spokespeople, with guiding principles, policies and procedures. We've got a whole flowchart of policies and procedures that actually keeps everybody accountable to a strong sense of equity and empowering work with survivors. There's an assessment of psychological readiness and a capacity to participate in professional mental health practitioner support in collaboration with that survivor. Informed consent about the purpose of each engagement. So even if somebody chooses to engage with the project itself, it doesn't mean they're consenting to any activity we ever ask them to do, which is why the invitation for each individual opportunity is so vital, because it is about giving somebody the opportunity to opt in and opt out of things that they feel comfortable and uncomfortable about along the course of their engagement. It involves a risk assessment and management strategies for any identified risks for both the survivor and their families. This is particularly relevant for survivors of trafficking, where they may have family members overseas, and their sharing of their story may get into local press and then cause a problem for their families. All of those things need to be considered when somebody's making a decision about public advocacy. The other step that we engage with is the development of a survivor public narrative. This is a very empowering exercise which allows people to take control of what information gets shared and what does not get shared. This includes the opportunity for people to be very clear about what is off limits to them. And that includes developing strategies that if somebody asks a question about something that's off limits to them, that they know how to bridge that question and provide an answer that isn't necessarily going to breach their own privacy and dignity. So we developed that public narrative over a series of months, and we tested out in some low-key, low-impact, safe sort of environments where people then have the opportunity to say, I didn't really feel good sharing that publicly, I've reconsidered. And we work that through so that their public narrative becomes a story that they're comfortable with people knowing, that they're comfortable sharing, that they're comfortable answering questions about, and is not giving over everything about themselves, to the universe, that they can keep parts of themselves to themselves, which allows them to maintain their identities as people, not just survivors of trauma. So the benefit to the survivor for their participation needs to be very clear, including financial compensation. So as many of you are probably aware, in the United States, there is an advisory committee of survivors. The Advisory Council on Human Trafficking was set up under Obama. And one of the particular survivors who's on that council wrote an article about 12 months ago, which really hit home in terms of the sort of tokenistic or, opportunistic involvement of survivors. Like anyone, trafficking survivors want to be recognised for their personal and professional contributions and accomplishments. Like any former victim will tell you, it's not enough to survive a terrible trauma because no individual should be defined or pigeonholed by the worst thing that ever happened to them. Should you feel compassion? Yes. Compassion is a great place to start, but it will count for so much more when channeled into an action that enables trafficking survivors to achieve what they're really after: purpose, competence, and independence. And I think that quote really, really speaks for itself when we say survivors are more than their experience, and they have expertise to offer beyond their experience. And it's so important that we create an environment for them to participate, to be equal, and to drive with purpose, their own purpose, not just the purpose of our organisations or the things that we wish to achieve by being able to highlight their stories. So when you think about whether or not this is something that you would like to take on or it challenges the way you're currently doing things, some questions that we can ask ourselves are we engaged? How do we currently engage with people with lived experience? Is there mutual benefit for both the survivor and your organisation? Who controls the survivor's engagement? So whilst I've talked a lot about sort of being that person's agent, and it sounds like we are controlling a lot on their behalf, it is because we're allowing them to take control of the opportunity. Often when you hand that over to other people like journalists, people lose the ability to control that opportunity. So by doing all of the vetting on their behalf and making sure that it's a respectful opportunity, it allows them to have the control to say yes or no. I'm not sure how many people have an experience of trying to say no to a journalist who wants a story. It's really unpleasant, at least in my experience, where they will literally try every technique to try and get that story. And you can't blame them at all. I mean, that's their job. But you can imagine that a survivor who's already feeling perhaps not on the same equal level, engaging with a journalist who really wants that story in order to make or break what they've got going on, and that survivor saying, no, I'm not going to give that to you, that can quickly lead into a slippery slope of giving the story to them anyway because the pressure is too much. And that, again, isn't the journalist's fault either. They're just doing their job, but it's because the survivor is in a position where they're not really sure how to navigate that, or to say yes or no and then sort of regret it later. Are we undermining our service delivery in the way that we work with survivors? I know many community service providers have really strong ethical frameworks for providing a service to people, and that often sort of starts to peter out when people become more involved with advocacy or being a voice for the issue, and that we can easily get into this space where it is easier to sort of see them as somebody, oh yes, they're willing to contribute, oh yes, they can come along to this thing, and it becomes a very organic process where that person is often lost in the process, which isn't how we would deliver a service. So thinking about our strong service frameworks and applying those principles to the same way in which we empower and work with survivors. Can you improve your current approach? And does your organisation want to adopt a consistent approach towards this area of work? It has to be an investment. It has to be something that you commit to. It can't simply be one person in the organisation that decides to do this, because everybody else around them, if they're not invested, the framework falls away. So it's also about considering whether or not your organisation is in a position to commit to such a framework. So I think I'm bang on time for questions now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much. This was incredible. I myself learned a lot. There's been a lot of nodding and note-taking in the room that I'm in, and texts from Jeannie. So there's a lot of engagement, a lot of enthusiasm, and several really good questions that I want to get to. And I'll start with the easy one, which is coming from an attorney at HT Pro Bono. I want to make sure I get this correct. The Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center. And they're wondering in particular if the training program itself, materials that you use with survivors you're working with, is available either online or if they were in touch with you, and how you sort of handle helping other organizations adopt a similar framework.
Yeah, sure. The materials would be available via myself. We don't put them online simply because they require context, and it makes it pretty difficult to just sort of dump the materials online and then not be able to walk somebody through the process. So yeah, if you want to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to sort of talk through those materials, share some of those things with you, and look at doing that in a more concrete way.
Great. And would you be okay with two things, Laura? One, sharing the recording of this webinar and sharing your contact information with folks?
Yes. One thing that I can share as well, I have a paper that I wrote with the psychologist that works with me on the project, which sort of talks about all of the theoretical foundations, and then it has some practical application in there as well. And the paper includes my contact details. So perhaps, Casey, if I send you the paper, you can distribute it with the webinar recording, and then anyone is free to get in touch with me.
That would be perfect. Thank you, Laura. And that actually leads right into my question, which is around the psychologist and that component of things, and whether or not that psychologist was trained by you guys as well, in particularly sort of just around not only serving trafficking survivors, but how to coach individuals through the process of sharing story and that kind of thing, or did they already come with that skill set and knowledge? And do they get paid for the sessions they do with the survivor advocates that you work with, or sort of how does that component work?
Yeah, so firstly, we're really lucky with the person that we have. She herself has worked with victims of human trafficking therapeutically for more than 10 years. So she came with a very solid basis of knowledge about the types of exploitation and the power dynamic at play, which was really helpful. The second thing is that, and this is a kind of an Australiana reference here, so forgive me if I lose some of you on this, but the way psychologists are trained in Australia is very clinical, and it's often very hard to work with people in a more organic way, because it's a very like boxed in approach. A psychologist we worked with comes from South America. So the basis of her training was really, really different to what we experience with other psychologists. So I'm not sure how that translates in the US context. I'm not sure how psychologists are trained. But comparatively, what we found with her is the way in which she works with people, particularly people of various cultural and linguistic backgrounds, was a really good fit for the project. And then we have worked together over the years around developing specific sessions and intervention points that are relevant to the program, which really are complemented because of her pre-existing knowledge base. And then the second element is, yes, we do pay her per session that she will deliver. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Got a handful more questions if you're willing to take them. So I will go to the next one. Yeah, which is whether or not this program has ever employed a survivor advocate full time. And if not, if the program offers any support or assistance to survivor advocates who are struggling to find viable employment opportunities beyond sort of the payment that they get for the one-off media engagements that they do.
Yeah. So it is our dream to employ a survivor. That is the next sort of where we would like to see the program continue to grow into. And that requires a much bigger, serious funding commitment. So like I can also, I guess, acknowledge up front the limitations, because if it, in my view, it would be a survivor who is employed to run this program, not me. So that would be the dream. But effectively, this program is amalgamated into a whole range of other projects that we run, which allows us to be able to fund it more effectively. The second thing is that what I didn't talk about is the support element of the project. Are those things, things like seeing somebody as a whole person and recognizing that in order for them to work equally with us, the other parts of their life have to be in order as well. So it stops short of being case management, but it certainly acknowledges the fact that sometimes people are going to have ups and downs and periods of their life where they're going to need other support, and we would absolutely 110% provide that. So because we have a whole service delivery arm of work that we do, we have a range of relationships with employers and various companies, for example. And so we would activate that if we had a survivor who was struggling to find employment. The other thing we do if somebody is studying is we match them with some like mentors to help them with their studies so they can succeed in that. So we do see the person as a whole person and work with all the various different things that present in their lives. Rather than just, oh, we see you as somebody who can contribute in this way, that they're a person first, and that's what we'll, sort of see and work with them on.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sounds like you guys have just a full commitment from the whole organization to make this program work, which is really amazing.
We have a really great donor as well, so we'll shout out and acknowledge our local donor, Project Futures, who they're just a pure fundraising organisation for a project in Cambodia and ourselves in Australia. So it's a pretty big commitment from them as well.
Well, that's huge. And if they have any interest in throwing money at the U.S. for this kind of project, you just
let them know. Interested folk.
Thank you. So now a bit of a tougher question, I think, that we definitely struggle with here at Tahereh, and I'm sure there are others who are struggling with it too, who are on the line, and thinking about this very proactive, deliberate, but also time-consuming approach to prepping a survivor being the ideal and sort of what you would always want to hold ourselves to, but also thinking about those moments where media and policy opportunities crop up suddenly, for example, at Tahereh in a particular state that might all of a sudden be considering a minimum age of marriage bill to end forced child marriage, taking all this time to prep a survivor that may fit the mold of the story that needs to be told to convince legislators to change the law might mean that we miss the boat on that opportunity to make change. And so we are here wondering if you see an ability to have both sorts of processes, both proactive and reactive, coexist, or if, you know, for the work to be done responsibly, you know, do those opportunities just sort of, you know, not be taken up if someone hasn't already been previously prepped who would be the right person interested in taking that opportunity and also seeing a benefit for them that is equal to the benefit of the work itself.
Yeah, so it is tough. And what I will say is it's about risk. So sometimes reactive opportunities work because the person that you're preparing already has a bit of a baseline that allows them to be prepared more quickly and more opportunistically. But it's really about assessing risk to that person, both physically and psychologically. It's a hard balance to strike because essentially you don't want to miss the opportunity, but there may not be a way to engage in the opportunity. We've had to say no many times to having that case study or the survivor come along for the ride because the risk was too great for that person. So our group of people right now is a group of 10 who have experienced human trafficking and slavery in all kinds of ways, and including survivors of forced marriage, and that each one of those people has their own way of engaging. So even though we might have a group of 10 survivors, we might not have a single person who's experienced forced marriage who's prepared to talk to the media. And unfortunately, we have to allow some of those opportunities to pass by. Some other workarounds that we do is some people might be comfortable with us providing like a de-identified written version of their case study rather than them being physically present. So I think it's a mixture of risk assessment, but also being prepared to let a really good opportunity pass by, because it's not going to be done in a way that is responsible.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make. And then I also did want to recognize that, and thank you for sharing the point about sort of the why of engagement for survivors that you explored a little bit earlier in the webinar with that really poignant example that you gave, because it's a really important point to make. It's also a really tough realization to come to, and a tough conversations to have with survivors and for survivors to have with themselves and with the psychologist in the example that you gave. Yeah. So I just wanted to recognize and acknowledge that example that you shared, as it's sort of related to that question.
Sure.
And one final question that I have, though, we do have about 9 minutes left. So if others have questions that are cropping up for them now, as people are saying thank you and this is a great webinar, if others, we still have about 40 people still on, want to ask questions or put comments in the chat box, please do. The one that I have from Tahereh is actually whether or not you have ever been questioned by the media that a story is authentic when a survivor is being paid to tell it, or has media ever shown a discomfort with that dynamic?
Yeah, well, two things. We don't tell the media that somebody's being paid. I mean, and if we were ever questioned about that, I would say, well, you know, usually they've interviewed myself or another one of my team members and a survivor, and I would say, well, I got paid by my organization to do this. And there is a sliding scale. It's quite transparent. If somebody asks, we will share it with them in terms of how we financially acknowledge somebody's time and an entire rationale. So I feel pretty confident that if somebody did question it, they would see that there's a whole backgrounder to that. I've never been questioned about it, to be honest. I think it's because we don't really tell people. I mean, we just kind of work with the assumption that this person is equal to us, and they will engage in an equal manner. And I mean, I think Australia is a much smaller place. There are a lot less people being exploited, I guess. So the opportunity for one person to get one person's story is a pretty big deal. So as a result of that, people feel pretty grateful that they're getting that opportunity. So yeah, I've not been questioned on it, but we have a whole justification. So if somebody did question us on it, it's about having all of that stuff lined up and therefore being able to just provide it when asked.
Great. Thank you. And I think somewhat related to that is another question around just how did you guys go about determining what would be the fair wage consulting rate for survivors for different types of engagement?
Yeah, sure. So we just used a social work consulting rate, which is this national standard in Australia. And we just, if we did any consulting work as social workers, that would be the rate that we would get paid. So we just adopted that scale.
Got it. And I know you have a hard stop in about 5 minutes, so I will just share these last two questions. Yeah, we got some interesting questions here at the end. One person wanting to know if you can tell us more about how survivors are assessed for participating by the mental health professional. I'm curious about the power dynamics or power issues around the mental health professionals, sort of whether or not they're actually determining when someone is ready, or if that's sort of a joint decision that the mental health professional and the individual are making together.
It's a joint decision by the person and the psychologist by working through certain things like motivation, purpose, what you hope to achieve, and also looking at what their trauma history actually is, and how they are triggered, whether or not opportunities like this will create a re-triggering or a re-traumatizing sort of environment for somebody. So like I said, it's really about the person self-identifying their interest to engage in this sort of work, and then they would engage with the psychologist. To be clear as well, the psychologist is a consultant to the project. So they are never involved in sort of the opportunities that are presented to people. They are not engaged in managing the project. So their interest in the project is solely about the mental health of the advocate. And they wouldn't often even know that there are what the opportunities are that are presented to people on an ongoing basis unless the advocate discloses that themselves. So it keeps the two processes very separate. And then the assessment is a 3-part assessment, which is about looking at their trauma history, their purpose for engaging, what they hope to achieve, their motivations, and then one of the sessions is support around developing a public narrative, and in developing that public narrative, what triggers them along the way in order to look at whether or not those triggers are risks of re-traumatization or things that are able to be managed. And it's those things that are then shared back to me, so I know how to manage those opportunities going forward.
Got it. Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question, and we only have one more left, and it is related, I think, to what you just went over. But one participant has asked, how do you continue to ensure that your engagement and the other staff involved in this project engaging with survivors remains empowering and doesn't stray into being paternalistic?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad somebody asked that question, actually, because it is something that we have to keep ourselves accountable to at all times. And it's about critical reflection. So I don't know how many people on the call are social workers, but it is about critical reflection in social work practice. And I personally have an external supervisor, somebody external to my organisation, that I meet with monthly to work through various different ethical dilemmas and scenarios and different things that I'm working on. And this is one of those things, because it is an area of work that requires a constant reflection of ethics, a constant reflection of positioning and of power. And so I find it really helpful to have that external person to hold me accountable. And it's about holding each other in the team accountable as well. So we don't make single line decisions about how people participate. It's a team sort of decision where we kind of, and everyone in our team will sort of put forward their perspective. We will challenge each other until we reach a point where there is some unity around that. And that can include sometimes bringing the survivor into that conversation to say, look, you know, we've got this opportunity, not really sure about it. Here's what we know. What do you think? And help them to also sort out that opportunity alongside us, as opposed to us sort of making the decision, going to the survivor and saying, are you interested in doing this? We can actually bring them into that conversation and say, we're not really sure. This is what it is. This is what we know. What do you think? And I think that helps draw that line between things becoming paternalistic and empowering because they're part of the decision-making process.
That's really incredible. Thank you for sharing that aspect of it. And we have a lot to aspire to here in the U.S., reflecting on the model that you presented today. And so I just want to say again, just number one, thank you for all the work that you've done, and for being with us today so early again, and for sharing this in such a comprehensive way. I can't wait to share the report that you wrote with the psychologist and the recording with everyone who was on the line today, and for those that were registered but weren't able to join us, because there's just been a lot of interest in this. So thank you for being with us today and for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, and happy holidays. I hope you have a peaceful rest.
You too.
And
thanks so much.
Thanks everyone else for joining.
Okay.
Have a great evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.